Welcome to the NFL slate breakdown for the wild card round on FanDuel and DraftKings. I'm Jason Gilbo. With me is Russell Clay. 4 games, two Saturday, two Sunday. I'm pretty stoked about the playoffs this year. I think the NFC is absolutely wide open. You are doing something with your face right now that is throwing me off, so I'm turning it to you.
Huh? You talking to me? Huh? You talking to me? Huh? That's my Robert De Niro. What do you guys think?
I
Pretty good, right?
No, the cafe value is way down on your De Niro impression.
Uh, it used to be good. That wasn't okay. To be fair, that wasn't my best. My optimal De Niro is probably like a B, like 8 out of 10. It's pretty good. That I just wasn't ready.
That did
You
not
know.
that did not, lead me to believe that your De Niro was any good at all.
You know what I am ready for? Wild card weekend.
It's
I'm
good.
ready for Tennessee to run the ball 45 times and lose.
Yeah, this slate, I think we were kind of looking at anticipating this slate to be pretty good, and the more you dive into it, you're like, some of these teams are
Mm,
just kind of not thrilling to use.
they've just been teams we've kind of avoided all year. I mean, on Buffalo, other than McCoy, I can't remember the last time I used anyone else on that offense. I guess you could say Charles Clay, but like Jacksonville with their receiver issues, Tennessee with their being a really awful team, that's kind of a problem for the playoffs. Atlanta just simply hasn't, put a good game together in a long time. Um, there's just some ugly teams, and then there's New Orleans and LA. So we do have that Kansas City. So that's nice, but yeah, it's a lot of mush to push through.
Yeah, let's dive into quarterback here. I think there's kind of a couple of clear-cut options. When you really look at things, I mean, the guys who have been the most steady quarterbacks in terms of fantasy production this year don't really come from these groups of games. I mean, Jared Goff's been great. He's your more expensive quarterback option. I think Goff and Smith are kind of my two favorites out of this group, and I think, I'll be sprinkling some others in.
Well, how about the Breeze Kamara Ingram stack, the FanDuel, I'll call it, which is just, Breeze is gonna get, his running backs 40 points a game. Let's just do all of them. But if you're not looking in that direction, I definitely think Goff and Smith are the way to go. I totally agree with that being chalk. But like good chalk, like on all the sites. I do like Cam Newton up there at the top tier. But Alex Smith has been awesome this year, and I expect that to continue against Tennessee, who does sort of create some bad game flow situations sometimes, but I'm not worried about that. I mean, Andy Reid can win this game, right? He usually messes up in the next round. Like he can win the wild card game. It's that next round against an actual good team where he just uses all of his timeouts in the third quarter or something. But wild
Yeah.
card is usually fine.
Yeah, I anticipate the Chiefs being able to roll through in this one. And I
Yeah.
just think Alex Smith is in a prize. And I think, the good thing about some of these quarterbacks is you can play them with their running backs because they get so much usage in the passing game. Like we've seen Kareem Hunt kind of start to become what he was the first few weeks of the season towards the end of the year. I think you can obviously play him with Alex Smith together. This is the best matchup of the week for a quarterback is this Alex Smith offense here, and I don't mind him. I think he can get exposure. I think he's fairly safe. Like Tennessee 24th in DVOA against the pass, 15th in fantasy points allowed. Like Smith does have some rushing upside in comparison to some of the other guys. Highest total of the weekend. Like I'm going to be going here quite a bit with this Chiefs offense.
Yeah, I agree. Moving to Cam Newton, I think we might have a slightly different take here. Greg Olson clearly not 100%. You kind of seen him limping around last week and wincing a few times when he got up. Obviously, you hate to see that. They haven't really targeted him other than that one game really all that much. I have to imagine he's had a setback. And if that's the case, then Cam Newton, the fantasy asset, Um, he can get that 10 to 12 points in the running game with 50 yards and a rushing touchdown, but he still does need that passing upside to truly, hit his ceiling. And Funchess is hurt. It's tough. It's tough to see the pathway to 25 fantasy points for Cam, unless he just goes absolutely bonkers in the run game. So, with that said, I do like him as a tournament guy. I just think Goff and Smith are safer.
Yeah, I do too. I mean, I think Newton's obviously in play for the potential upside. He can easily be the highest scoring player on the slate. Um, we've kind of looked at his games this year. Like he put up 20 fantasy points. He put up 11 fantasy points in the two meetings against the Saints. I think that's kind of in his range of outcomes as far as both go. Like there is a lower floor here. Like the good thing is he's getting about 5 to 12 fantasy points through rushing yards, but his passing upside has been really limited. He's only thrown for over 200 yards 7 times this season. He's had 10 games where he's thrown on just 1 or 0 touchdowns. If he gets, 2 rushing touchdowns, if he gets 50, 60 rushing yards, like that's obviously a ton of potential because he's going to throw for probably 150, 175 yards. I do just worry, like you have Lattimore who can take Funchess away. There isn't really a secondary wide receiver option on this team. You can check down to McCaffrey all you want, but that doesn't do much for Newton's upside. So if Olsen's banged up, like it's not a great matchup for him. I'm not as high on Newton as maybe some other people are this week, but I do think you can still use him.
Yeah, Drew Brees, again, I mentioned he's kind of a stacking option with his running backs. So if you're playing Kamara, I'm fine with playing Brees, but as a pure play, he just doesn't really have that upside. And it's to no fault of his own. It's just their running game's so effective. He doesn't need to. And they're at home. If they can kind of control the clock here, I can just see Kamara and Ingram just eating up Carolina. So if that's not the case and Carolina just kind of goes in there and blows him out, maybe you'll see a little upside. But even in those situations this year, Brees hasn't had that same type of upside. He doesn't really have a Cooks anymore. Ginn's fine, and he's been uber productive on like 70 targets this year, but he's not a guy that like will dominate in garbage time. He's not a possession guy. He drops those possession catches. So I don't see the upside for Brees here.
I don't either. He's not in my first 4 quarterbacks I'm using. I mean, if you're building a ton of lineups that can get some exposure to him, I think Carolina's pass defense is a little bit overrated, so I'm not afraid of using Brees, and I'm not afraid of using like a Thomas or Ginn. But I think if I want exposure to Brees, I'm getting it through, Kamara, I'm getting it through Ginn, I'm getting it through Thomas instead.
Right, exactly.
As far as these secondary options go, like Matt Ryan, Blake Bortles, Marcus Mariota. I mean, the only way I kind of see these types of guys, more so Mariota and more so Ryan, is any sort of upside is if they get behind early and they have to kind of push the pace. I think that more so for the Carolina side. The upside's been severely capped for Matt Ryan. It's been severely capped for Mariota all year. But if we can get positive game script for them, I don't think it's out of the question. And they're at their prices. I think they're worthy GPP shots.
Yeah, I'll always buy. I trust, Matt Ryan has a lot of playoff experience. We kind of still, I don't know about anyone else, but I kind of still view him as a young quarterback. The dude has been around a while. He's been in a lot of big playoff games. Obviously, some things haven't gone their way, but he's been in a lot of big games against NFC opponents. And I could definitely see him having sort of a renaissance game this week. And I don't know who it's going to go to. Hopefully it's Julio. But if not, I mean, I could see, Levine Toilolo getting a touchdown and all this random stuff happening. But we look down and Ryan has, 300 yards and 3 touchdowns. So I like him a lot as a tournament guy.
Yeah, I think the potential for 250 yards and 2 touchdowns is not the question here. I mean, he doesn't have the rushing upside as like an Alex Smith or Drew Brees or, even a Jared Goff, but I like him. I think we've seen quite a few games here in LA kind of turn into shootouts, and that has a potential here this week with really all the playmakers on both sides. I don't feel the need to kind of dive down into the Blake Bortles and Tyrod Taylors this week just because I think that game's going to just be really ugly. If there's any scoring, I think it's going to be basically kicking and running backs.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. I feel no need to play Mariota or Tyrod or Bortles. I guess you could play Bortles, um, but I think I'm going with. I just don't want to deal with Blake Bortles in the playoffs. You know what I mean?
Buffalo's run or pass defense isn't that bad, and like
Yeah.
I think Fournette's going to be. I think this is just going to be such a slow, grinded out game where those guys are going to get. Fournette's going to get 25 touches here against a Buffalo defense that has struggled in the second half of the season. I don't see the need that Bortles is going to have to air it out here and kind of push the pace. Like we've seen that the past couple of weeks. There's no denying that Bortles has been great and he's shown the upside. If you're building multiple lineups, sure, but like I said, I mean it's Goff, it's Smith, it's Ryan, it's Newton for me.
Yep. Exactly.
Let's move to running back. This is obviously a pay up spot because there's really no ways to pay down this week unless Freeman gets banged up and has a setback. But we are really just looking to pay up. This is the spot where you kind of want to get exposure.
Yeah. I mean, let's start with the value though. Derrick Henry clearly in line for a huge workload, and I'm certainly going to be excited about that. The upside is there. Obviously, he's pretty inconsistent with. He's a big run type guy. He's not really a chunk play like Ezekiel Elliott type. He's big play and then a bunch of nothings. So he's sort of a risky play in that sense, but he's going to get so many touches that I actually don't think he's that risky. So I like him a lot, especially on FanDuel at 6,500. So I think he's a great play. And then I guess it depends on what you think of Christian McCaffrey, Tevin Coleman, and Freeman, like you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are the value options. Like they're not quite as cheap. I mean, I think Henry's a much better play on FanDuel than I do on DraftKings, where he's 6K. Because you have Freeman who's 300 more, you have McCaffrey who's 400 more, you even have Ingram who's only 900 more. So I think he's kind of site dependent. I do worry about Henry a little bit if the Chiefs do get out to a lead. He hasn't really gotten the opportunity, but he hasn't shown much in the passing game. And if that becomes a thing where they're not really running the ball or controlling the clock, I think his floor and upside's a little bit lower.
See, I think he stays out there on third downs. I know he hasn't gotten a lot of receiving sort of, targets, but I do think he'll stay out there on third down if they're losing. So yeah, I'm pretty all in, but I'm also super biased because I've been a big fan for a while. So
yeah, I mean, no denying that he's going to be out there. I just worry, is he going to get those targets? Is he going to get those 5 to 6 targets if they are down 2 touchdowns or down 10?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't mind him. Obviously, he's cheap enough to deploy. It's not a bad matchup. We've seen Kansas City be pretty subpar against the run this year. You mentioned Tevin Coleman. I kind of like him either way. Like, I like taking a shot on Coleman because he has that big play upside. He can take a screen for 40 yards to the house. He can bust one from 30 yards out. I think he's the guy that I'm kind of going to be looking to get some exposure to, whether Freeman plays or not.
I agree, and he's cheap. I think that's really the main point of it. And again, I think we're talking about Atlanta as a potential, sneaky play. If Freeman's out, maybe you can throw Coleman in a Matt Ryan lineup and hope that Atlanta just kind of takes it to the Rams somehow. So, and even if you don't play Matt Ryan, I think all these Atlanta players are very sneaky tournament plays.
Yeah, I mean, the Rams defense has not been great against the run this year. Second most fantasy points allowed per game, 22nd DVOA. Like, we've seen some backs, especially backs that are multidimensional, kind of torch the Rams in the past. So, both Freeman and Coleman obviously very much in play this week. When you're kind of moving up the charts, we get into this next tier. You mentioned Christian McCaffrey. I don't think he's a bad option this week. I think he's obviously a little bit more in play on DraftKings given the site scoring, but I mean, 15.9, 23.7 fantasy point games against the Saints earlier this year. They do give up plenty of fantasy production to backs in the passing game. They're also not great against the run. Like, I think McCaffrey could have a decent day. I think McCaffrey is actually the key if Carolina can keep this game close or even pull out an upset. Like, I think McCaffrey has that big game. If McCaffrey has a dud, I think Carolina struggles.
Yeah, you could be right. If they have a bad game, though, do we see those fourth quarter like prevent defense like chunk plays? We certainly could be in for that, especially in the playoffs. Teams do not just give up like in the regular season, so I could definitely see some dump offs and garbage time. But as you mentioned, he's a much better DraftKings play than on FanDuel. You really need that touchdown from him to really compete with the upper tier guys. So I like him as a value. More of a tournament guy though.
Yep, I'm with you. Kind of moving up the chain. Leonard Fournette in a good spot this week. Clearly, they had no issue with his health. Last week given a full workload. Great spot here against Buffalo. It's kind of he's kind of in that tier 2 for me. Like, it's him and Kareem Hunt, and then like Gurley and Kamara just kind of edge him out. Like, those are kind of my 4 guys up top.
Yeah, I like him a lot. I think people are going to look at those box scores of the last, month and a half, and he's been kind of bad. But it's been weird games, weird game flows. This should be big in favor of Jacksonville. I mean, this game shouldn't be close. Buffalo is awful. They're really awful. They're really, really bad. I'm sorry, Buffalo fans. And I'm sure you're dealing with some snow today. But your team is freaking horrific. They're really bad. And, Jacksonville is not bad. And I just think we're going to see 25 touches for Fournette. He's cheaper than the other guys. I think him versus Hunt is a great debate. I'm slightly going Fournette, but they're both great options and probably my 2 favorite backs on the slate. I think that might be a hot take.
Yeah, I mean, everything sets up well for Fournette here. Like, they're 9-point favorites at home. I think 2 good passing defenses kind of put everything in Fournette's way to get, like you said, 25 touches. Great matchup against Buffalo, who have struggled against the run. I don't mind him. I think, like you said, the only reason that stops me from kind of ranking Hunt over him is the fact that the Chiefs do have other options you can get exposure to. I'm not high on the Jacksonville passing game this week. I'm kind of waiting for that wide receiver thing to kind of clear up. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But, Fournette, I think, is just the easiest exposure to Jacksonville. And he comes at a little bit of a discount from some of the other guys.
Right. It's like really simple, cut and dry what's going to happen in that game from Jacksonville's offense. We know what we're going to get. And, looking at DVOA and advanced data, Bills are just bad against the run. So you're probably going to see some of those chunk plays we haven't seen from Fournette in a while.
Yep, I'm in agreement. Kareem Hunt, 25, 42, 20, and 9 fantasy point games over the last 4 weeks. That 9 just came last week against Denver, where he had 1 touch, and that was a 35-yard touchdown.
I
know. Tennessee has a decent run defense, but they do rank 32nd DVOA against pass catching backs. Like, we saw Gurley exploit that passing defense. Yeah. I think Hunt's very much in play. You can play him with Smith as well. He's seen a little bit more targets. The touches are back to a more consistent rate, especially inside the red zone. Hunt's just another guy here. Like, there's 4 or 5 really good running backs this week that all could put up 20-plus fantasy points, and Hunt's another one. Like, he's part of this Chiefs coil that I'm going to get some exposure to.
He's really good. And obviously had that regression in the middle of the year, but finally turned it on the last few weeks when they handed over the play calling, getting a ton of red zone looks. Also getting a nice receiving sort of target share. that you just mentioned about Gurley taking advantage of Tennessee a few weeks ago. That's what we're looking at for Hunt as well. Obviously, he doesn't have that type of upside in this game, but 20 points certainly in the range of outcomes, and I'd say it's most likely he ends up between 15 and 20 points, which that's pretty high floor.
Yeah, I think the floor is fairly stable. I like Hunt quite a bit this week. The Saints running backs, quite a difference in pricing between Kamara and Ingram. I still prefer Kamara. Like Kamara's just the guy. He just has so much upside. Put up 29 fantasy points against Carolina earlier this season. Obviously, the first game against Carolina, AP was still in the mix. Like he wasn't fully used yet, but I, I mean, it's just such a good spot. Like Carolina's been pretty average against pass catching backs. This offense just flows so well to the point where I'm not really worried about the rush defense either.
Yeah, I like both of them. I think you just mix and match. Kind of how I've been playing DFS the last um, you know, month and a half to 2 months of the season, because I know Kamara's been more consistent with the upside, but when you look at some of Ingram's high upside games, he's had a few 30-point games. So I think his upside can't be ignored. You can go with a lot of Kamara exposure, but be aware, Ingram's, rushing touchdown upside is just as high.
Yeah, I agree. I think Ingram's the great pivot away from Kamara because I think Kamara will be the more, higher popular owned back. And I just think, like you said, Ingram has that potential for 100 yards on the ground, 2 touchdowns. Like that's in his range of outcomes. So, yeah, I mean, if I'm going 10 lineups and I want exposure to Saints in all of them, I think Kamara, it's going to be like I use him in 7 and then use Ingram in 3.
Definitely.
So let's talk Todd Gurley. I don't know what it is about you and Todd Gurley. Big fan, but for some reason he doesn't get the love he deserves from you in the fantasy world.
I'm just afraid. I'm just an afraid Rams fan. It just doesn't feel right that they're in this position as a pretty solid favorite. It's so hard to believe, and they're such a young team. I hate to be this guy, and I've been a Debbie Downer, and they've been proving me wrong, but this is hard to believe that they're just going to wipe the floor with Atlanta. I just have a really hard time believing.
But no one's saying wipe the floor. Like, Gurley, whether this game blows out, Atlanta's way, whether this game blows out, the Rams' way.
Gurley's 10K on FanDuel, so you're believing he's going to score 25 to 30 points, if you're playing him, basically.
Yeah, I mean, at that price, I guess you can make the case to fade him. Of course, you can make the case to fade anyone on a 4-game playoff slate because of the volatility. But
right.
He scored 20+ fantasy points. This is DK in 10 of 15 games this season. We look at Atlanta; they struggle against pass catching backs. We know that they're only 20th in DVOA against the run. Like whether they load the box, whether they put a focus on Gurley, whether the Rams get behind, he's going to be used. He's going to see 20+ touches in this game. Atlanta's defense, the fantasy points allowed don't look great on paper, but they're not that great of a defense. They're average at best. If they turn up and play well, I still think the Rams put up, 3-4 touchdowns in this spot. Like I think if the Rams are going to lose, it's because of a shootout. I don't think it's because their offense gets stopped.
Fair enough. I do worry about the traction in this game for both teams. I think this could be lower scoring than I want it to. So that's my hesitance. Clearly, I'm just a worried fan. So take it for what it's worth.
Let's talk Bills backs real quick. McCoy obviously suffered, the injury last week. He's game time decision this week. I don't see any real need in using him, whether he plays or not. I mean, once again, if you're building multiple lineups, you can go ahead and do it. But there's only like 2 guys on Buffalo that I'm considering using this week, and that's even a stretch.
Yeah, I don't know, man. If it's not McCoy, I'm out, basically.
Yeah, I don't see the need to kind of dive down. Like Jacksonville's rush defense obviously still can't be beaten, but I'm not going there.
Definitely.
Wide receiver, this is obviously an interesting spot because, if you're paying up at running back, which you should be doing this week, it kind of leaves you a little bit limited in this range. Let's top tier guys. It's kind of three tier one options, I would say. It's Julio Jones, Michael Thomas, Tyreek Hill, kind of all in their own kind of price range. Uh, Jones is obviously a guy who can put up 200 yards and a touchdown on any given day.
Yeah, and they've started to go to him. 11 targets in 3 of the last 4 games. So this is kind of what I was looking for earlier in the year. I can no longer complain, even though I can complain. But, he is getting the usage now. LA, not necessarily the team that you'd expect to give up a 200 receiving yard game to a wide receiver, but Julio can certainly do that against just about anybody. So I like him quite a bit. I definitely prefer Michael Thomas, though, in that top tier,
That's you do, huh?
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. I don't mind Thomas. It's a sneaky good spot for him. Like, this Carolina secondary isn't something that I really think is one that you fade against. Like, these two corners don't shake me off of him. I like Thomas here in this spot. I like Jones a little bit more for a similar price just because I think Jones has a higher upside, but I think their floors are very similar.
Yeah, I just look at the 2 Carolina games they played this year. Thomas had 780 and a touchdown in basically both games. And so I just think his floor is really high. I don't know what to do here. I think Julio's a good tournament guy. I don't love him as a cash guy. I'm just thinking about if I'm going with wide receiver, I kind of want a high floor because I don't know what's going to go on with Julio in this game.
Yeah, I mean, we're looking at Tremaine Johnson as possibly being the guy who shadows him, which doesn't concern me too much. Yeah, I mean, I think obviously those two are coming in as your top 2 options, and I don't think they're must plays on this slate. I think you can kind of sit in this mid range as well. Let's move to Tyreek Hill. He's kind of volatile, but I mean, he's kind of been somewhat consistent this year. Like, he's had 75 catches, nearly 1,200 yards, and 7 touchdowns. 6 or more targets in all but 1 game this year. Like, he's going to get his 6 to 8 touches. Titans middle of the road matchup, 14th in fantasy points allowed to opposing wideouts. Hill's just that guy. Like, if you're not rolling Kelsey, if you're not rolling, Hunt, like, I think obviously Hill has that potential. Like, he has a huge 20+ fantasy point potential in this spot. He's just kind of that pivot away from the other Chiefs guys.
Yeah, I think Tyreek Hill's just kind of the same guy every week, pretty much regardless of matchup. Like, at some point, the guy who runs a 4-2 is going to get open in your secondary. If Alex Smith can hit him, it's going to be a 60-yard touchdown. So, I mean, that's kind of how it's gone this year. We saw him kind of toast Miami secondary. We saw him get Dallas's secondary on that weird play. Got New England, got Oakland, the Jets twice, the Chargers. So it's pretty random, who he does it against. So I think he's just always in that tournament range, and I'm not afraid to play him.
No, I'm not either. Let's talk Rams wideouts. Fully healthy here. Robert Woods, Cooper Kupp, Sammy Watkins. There's no doubt that Woods has probably been the best fantasy wide receiver when healthy this year off the Rams, although Cooper Kupp had a good stretch of games too. Atlanta 25th in DVO against wide receiver ones. Look at Woods. He scored all, in double-digit fantasy points in all but 4 games this year. He's a little bit expensive, but I think Woods and Watkins and Kupp all make viable stacking options with Goff this week.
Totally agree. I think you can kind of mix and match wherever, especially on playoff slates and tournament formats. I think you mix and match there. Watkins obviously upside, and they do go to him in the goal line, a little bit. So that's nice. And Kupp has just been a nice all-around threat for them this year. So Who knows what this game brings? I think they're all guys you can take shots on, though. I do like Woods as the best play, though.
Yep, I do this too. Guy I'm not on is Devin Funches this week. Expected to be shadowed by Lattimore. Funches just hasn't looked healthy. I mean, you can take shots if you're trying to stack him with Cam and GPPs, but at his price, like I just don't know if I'm going to be going there. The floor just really isn't that high. Over his last 8 games, his floor is 5.9 fantasy points.
Ever since Greg Olsen came back, it's been really, really weird usage and definitely less than what he was getting before. He's fine, but like you mentioned, Lattimore, sort of shadowing him around the field is not going to be good for fantasy points. So pretty easy fade, especially if you're paying up at running back. You probably won't be looking at him in that range anyway. So unless you're going super contrarian with a Cam Funches stack, you're going to be looking lower anyway.
Yeah, I think this tier of like Mohamed Sanu, Ted Ginn, even a Richard Matthews, like I think those all guys are viable kind of tier 3 value options. Like, Sanu's going to be a guy who just kind of gets you like 8 to 12 fantasy points, which, completely fine at his price tag on this slate. You're going to need him. Richard Matthews obviously saw just 2 targets last week, but Chiefs, I mean, still not a great secondary. Like they added Darrelle Revis. That doesn't scare me. He hasn't been great. 29th in terms of fantasy production for the Chiefs defense against opposing wideouts this year. So I think Rashard Matthews and even Corey Davis, as much as I hate to say it, are viable GPP options. Matthews is probably safe enough for cash.
Yeah, I like Matthews. Kansas City's given up a ton of chunk plays this year. Matthews is sort of that type of guy, and that's who Mariota looks to deep down the field. So I like him quite a bit in that range, especially on FD. Sanu, you mentioned, great play on all sites. Ginn always has that potential for that 40-yard touchdown. As I mentioned, he's not going to get you that volume, but he could get you that 12 to 15 points, which could be, huge on this slate. So the Jaguars receivers, man, I think we have to wait till, really pretty much day of to fully decide what's going on with Marquise Lee. I guess he's going to play, but how healthy is he? He's had a bunch of ankle injuries in the past, and, I can remember full seasons where he didn't look great because of that ankle. I believe it was his second season. He played the entire year, and he was just not himself. So if that's the Marquise Lee we get, you might see Blake Bortles start going in Keelan Cole and Dede Westbrook's direction. So it's definitely something to think about,
Yeah, if Lee plays, like Allen Hurns is already healthy. I think you can take a GPP shot on Hurns. I think you can take a viable GPP shot on Westbrook as well. Keelan Cole's a little bit expensive, like he's 5,400 on DK because he's been so great, down the stretch. But I don't know. I mean, like you said, this is going to be kind of a Friday night, Saturday morning type thing where we need to keep an eye on it. Not to mention, this isn't really a great spot. Like Tre'Davious White has been an excellent corner this year. I'll dive into kind of more of the wide receiver cornerback matchups in that pod and article. But, Buffalo's pass defense, their corners, EJ Gaines, when healthy this year, they've been a really good 1-2 punch. And that kind of takes away my excitement for these Jacksonville wideouts. So I don't mind him in GPPs. I think with Watkins, Matthews, Ginn, Sanu kind of in a similar price range, I'm going to be going that way. On the other side of things, Kelvin Benjamin, he's 3,500 on DK. Don't play him on FanDuel. He's just a punt option if you're kind of looking that route. Like targets are completely volatile. Tyrod Taylor, obviously not a big down the field throwing guy. It's a bad matchup. It's going to be AJ Bouye, Jalen Ramsey. Like it's not a good spot for Benjamin, but for the potential volume in this spot, Kelvin Benjamin at 3,500, it's not the worst play in the world.
Another guy who's been getting a lot of targets is Eric Decker, 4,800 on FanDuel. Obviously, not the Eric Decker from years past, but I think he's definitely a guy we can put into our lineups pretty confidently at that price, especially if you want to try to make a Gurley Kamara lineup. That's really, you're going to have to dive down, so someone to think of.
Yeah, I don't mind it. Anyone else a wide receiver you want to talk about?
Not really. I don't think there's much lower, you know.
Yeah. Tight ends this week. I mean, it's kind of clear cut number one. Travis Kelce. It's a good spot for him. 24th in DVOA for the Titans against tight ends this season, middle of the road in fantasy points allowed. You just kind of expect those 7 to 8 targets in this spot for Kelce. And, I'm not worried about plugging him in with other options. I'll use him in the same lineup with Kareem Hunt. I know we've kind of seen some negative correlation with those two this year, but if the Chiefs kind of can go out there and put up plenty of points, it's going to be fine for both these guys.
Tight end, you always sweat going 100% like on two guys, but I'm pretty much honing in on Delaney and Kelce, and I might just say screw off to everyone else. That never ends well because Mercedes Lewis is certainly getting three TDs if I do that, but there's just no other real good options on this slate. I guess you could go with Charles Clay in a potential comeback mode type move, but I just think it's really Delaney and Kelce, and then everyone else. I like Olsen, but he's hurt, and I believe you mentioned New Orleans is pretty good against tight ends, so it's pretty clearly Kelce and Walker for me.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there. I think Olsen, 9, 6, 12 targets since returning from injury, but he's caught 4 of his last 15 targets. At his price is like he's 6,900 on FanDuel. He's 5K on DraftKings. You can spend 800 more and get Kelce from Olsen, so I kind of think you go that route on FanDuel. You can make the case for dropping down on DraftKings. I have no issue with Walker. You mentioned Charles Clay. Like, if he's healthy this week, I'm fine with it. Targets over the last 4 weeks, 5, 9, 10, and 8. Jaguars 20th in DVOA against tight ends this year. They also allow 6 attempts per game. That's more than wide receiver 2s and 3s because of that secondary. Clay's fairly cheap. He leads the team in catches this year and receiving yards because they have no one else. So on DK, I think you can make the case for him, especially in a double tight end lineup. If he can get you 12, 15 fantasy points here, it's kind of about it, though.
Yeah, and then you kind of go down the list. I'm not really worried about anyone else hurting me. So Hooper, Higbee, Lewis, those types of guys, I'm not worried about hurting me.
Nick O'Leary 3 touchdowns possibly, but
yeah, like if that happens, then that happens. So.
Kickers this week on FanDuel, especially on these 4-game slate, to nail the kicker is super crucial. For me, it's probably going to be Butker this week. We've seen the Chiefs be able to move the ball. The problem is, I want all these Chiefs guys. I want them scoring touchdowns. I don't want field goals.
That's a tough one. But Harrison Butker's a pretty handsome guy. So I think if he goes over to Andy and is like, hey, listen, bro, you got to relax. I got to get my points. He's going to be like, he's going to look into his eyes and be like, you know what, Harrison? You're right, man. I'm going to kick some field goals here. And then they're going to lose. But you'll get your Harrison Butker points. How about that?
Yeah, I think Butker's obviously a guy that you can look at. Will Lutz at home is a pretty consistent option as well. I don't hate Josh Lambo or Graham Gano. I'm not really in on like Hauschka or Suck up here in the spot, or Bryant even. I think Bryant's decent, but I kind of like those other 3 options a little bit more.
Yeah, I kind of like – I've gone with the top tier guy all year, and it's just – I'm going to continue headed in that direction. Lutz, Bryant, Butker. That's pretty much it for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of the way to go. Defenses this week, kind of an interesting spot. Obviously, I think, Jacksonville's going to be a team that kind of everyone looks to. You got to pay the price tag to get them. They're 5,600. On FanDuel, they're 3,700 on DraftKings. Do you like paying up here? Sorry, 4,400 on DraftKings. Do you like paying up here for the Jags? As I spit out like 8 different salaries.
I I like the Jags. Again, I think they're the best odds at blowing out a team because Buffalo is just so bad. Just go home. Don't even show up. That's how bad you are. It's just not even worth evaluating you. You're terrible. Just sit in the corner. You know what I'm saying? So with that thought, Jacksonville clearly the top play. You can kind of think about the Chiefs. They're my clear tier 2 just because Tennessee's so bad. So I think that's kind of the two main directions I've going. They've also been, pretty good in terms of fantasy points the last 4 weeks. So I like that.
Yeah, I think those are the two kind of clear-cut cash GPP options. There's two other teams I don't mind, though. We talked about the Falcons. We talked about potential shootout here. But the Rams have kind of a intriguing high-scoring fantasy defense that I wouldn't mind sprinkling in some GPPs because they can put up some fantasy points. Look at the Rams.
Yeah.
3 point. Hold on, good sir. Let me hype up your Rams defense here. 1.75 turnovers over the last 8 games, 3.4 sacks per game. They have a ceiling of 15.5 fantasy points over the last 8. They kind of have that potential given their price tag. Like, you can take some shots here.
If Atlanta continues on what they've been all year, then yes, they will be one of the best defensive options in terms of fantasy points. Only 4,700 on FD. So yeah, I'm certainly in on that idea. I just would be afraid of getting too much exposure as I'm still a little afraid of Atlanta. New Orleans, Carolina, I'm staying away from in terms of defenses. I just think both of those teams are going to do pretty well. I guess you could go with the Saints if you're going to go with one of them, though. But overall, yeah, probably staying away from those two.
Yeah, I mean, Saints and GPPs, I don't mind. If you're building a ton of lineups, if you're trying to kind of fit some studs in, it's a crazy play, but the Bills defense for basically bare min on this slate, like they're 4,200 on FanDuel, they're 2,500 on DK. If they slow down Fournette, and that's a big if, I think they can be fine. I think there's always potential pick six with Bortles here. I think their cornerbacks match up well with their wideouts. So this is by far the lowest scoring game on the slate. I think you can take a shot at the Bills and just kind of hope that they can get you 8 points because that's a pretty significant difference, especially if no other team really pops off at that bare min. Like, they're saving you, 600, 800, even $1,000 if you're kind of looking at those top tier defenses.
I would trash this play, but I played the Browns last week and it worked out. So I'm not going to knock this, but it's kind of like you mentioned, you don't need them to get 15. If they can get 8, then you're all set. On FanDuel is a little different, but DK, I like that call.
Certainly. So give us your winners for the week. Let's round it out some winners.
Jacksonville, for sure. Buffalo is not even going to show up. Kansas City in a blowout. It's going to come down to a field goal in Atlanta, LA. I don't know who's going to win that game. And then I'm taking Carolina. I think they're pretty good. I think they're a really good team. So I like them.
I'm taking the 4 home teams this week. I'm taking the favorites.
Okay.
I think it's pretty straightforward. I like the Carolina upset call. I think the Falcons have a choice as well, but
the other two are just like,
pretty straightforward.
Yeah, definitely.
So, that's going to wrap it up for us. You can head over to dayfantasycafe.com. The optimizer up and running for this week. Projections are good to go. Check your My Dashboard for your cheat sheets as well, both FanDuel and DraftKings up on the site. And good luck here in the wildcard round.